Welcome back to every Major League Baseball player ever. Today we're doing last names starting with the letter C. Today we're starting with Jose Caballero, Putsy Caballero, Terry Cabaginos, Cable, Cesar Cabral, Alberto Cabrera, Alex Cabrera, Alfredo Cabrera, Asdrubal Cabrera, Daniel Cabrera, Edward Cabrera, Iverth Cabrera, Fernando Cabrera, Francisco Cabrera, Genesis Cabrera, Holbert Cabrera, Jose Cabrera, Lorenzo Cabrera, Luis Cabrera, Mauricio Cabrera, Melky Cabrera, Miguel Cabrera, Orlando Cabrera, Oswaldo Cabrera, I hope he gets well soon, Rafael Cabrera, Raymond Cabrera, Craig Sasek, Edgar Cesares, Kevin Cesares, Greg Carteret, Joe Cade, Leon Kedor, Charlie Cady, Forrest Cady, Tom Cafego, Joe Caffey, Ben Caffin, Wayne Cage, John Cahill, Tommy Cahill, Trevor Cahill, Bob Kane, Les Kane, Lorenzo Kane, Marion Kane, Matt Kane, Sugar Kane, Cameron Kane Cross, Miguel Caro, George Caithhammer, Evelo Calderon, Benito Calderon, Ivan Calderon, Sam Calderon, Bruce Caldwell, Charlie Caldwell, Earl Caldwell, Mike Caldwell, Ralph Caldwell, Ray Caldwell, Kiko Calero, Bill Calhoun, Jack Calhoun, Jeff Calhoun, Cole Calhoun, Lefty Calhoun, Roland Calhoun, Willie Calhoun, Carmen Cali, Fred Caligari, Will Callahan, Orlando Calixtre, Alex Call, Marty Callaghan, Pat Callaghan, Ben Callahan, Dave Callahan, Ed Callahan, Jamie Callahan, Jim Callahan, Jamie Callahan, Joe Callahan, John Callahan, Leo Callahan, Ray Callahan, Wes Callahan, Alberto Calapso, Frank Calloway, Mickey Calloway, Tyler Caliban, Johnny Callison, Ron Calloway, Dick Calmus, Mark Calvert, Paul Calvert, Blair Calvo, Jack Calvo, Napoleon Calzado, Ernie Camacho, Daniel Carmana, Jer Carmago, Jordan Carmago, Fred Cambria, Hank Camille, Daz Cameron, Jack Cameron, Kevin Cameron, Mike Cameron, Noah Cameron, Dolph Camel, Doug Camel, Lou Camel, Quimedes Caminero, Junior Caminero, Ken Caminti, Eric Kamenak, Harry Kamitz, Howie Camp, Kid Camp, Lou Camp, Rick Camp, Sean Camp, Tony Campana, Roy Campanella, Hall of Famer, Bert Campaneris, Al Campanis, Jim Campanis, Count Campow, Archie Campbell, Bill Campbell, Billy Campbell, Billy Campbell, Brett Campbell, Bruce Campbell, Bullet Campbell, Dave Campbell, David Campbell, Emma Campbell, Eric Campbell, Jilly Campbell, Hugh Campbell, Isaiah Campbell, Jim Campbell, Joe Campbell, John Campbell, Kevin Campbell, Christian Campbell, Mark Campbell, Michael Campbell, Mike Campbell, Paul Campbell, Ron Campbell, Sam Campbell, Soup Campbell, Vin Campbell, Gardel Camper, Gustavo Campero, Sal Campfield, Jorge Campillo, Joe Campini, Sal Campisi, Frank Campos, Jose Campos, Leonel Campos, Roberto Campos, Luis Campusana, Sil Campusana, Jim Canada, George Canale, Alexander Canario, Willie Canada, Hugh Canavan, Jim Canavan, Robinson Cancel, Casey Candel, John Candelera, Jamer Candelario, Milo Candini, Tom Candiotti, John Caniria, John Cangalosi, Mark Kanha, Avelino Canzineres, Barbarzo Canizares, Jay Canizaro, Walter Kennedy, Wirt Cannell, Griffin Canning, Andy Canizaro, Chris Canizaro, Joe Cannon, Jonathan Cannon, Richard Cannon, Jose Cano, Robinson Cano, Yeaner Cano, Jose Cansenko, Ozzy Cansenko, Joey Cantillo, Denjo, Kenton, Guy Cantrell, Jorge Cantu, Ben Cantwell, Mike Cantwell, Tom Cantwell, Bart Cantz, Russ Canzier, Dominic Canzone, Connor Capel, Mike Capel, Jose Capellan, Lefty Capers, Doug Capilla, Carter Caps, Matt Caps, George Capuzella, Buzz Capra, Nick Capra, Vinny Capra, Pat Capri, Ralph Caprone, Chris Capuana, Estiaro Carabello, Ramon Carabello, Matt Carasati, Victor Caratani, Pat Caroy, John Carbine, Bernie Carbo, John Carden, Jose Cardenel, Adrian Cardenas, Francisco Cardenas, Leo Cardenas, Randy Cardinal, Javier Cardenana, Ben Cardoni, Stephen Cardulo, Don Caldwell, Rod Caro, Andy Carey, George Carey, Max Carey, Paul Carey, Roger Carey, Tom Carey, Ed Caffrey, Bobby Cargo, Esmeline Caridad, Andrew Carrington, Fred Carish, Fred Carl, John Carl, Shane Carl, Jim Carlton, Tex Carlton, Jim Carlin, Luke Carlin, Matt Carlise, Sylvester Carlise, Walter Carlise, Cisco Carlos, Dan Carlson, Dylan Carlson, Hal Carlson, Jesse Carlson, Leon Carlson, Albin Carlstrom, Drew Carlton, Steve Carlton, Buddy Carly, Cleo Carly, Rye Carly, Dan Kamen, George Kamen, Duke Carmel, Chet Carmichael, Rafael Carmona, Eddie Carnett, Bill Carney, Jack Carney, Pat Carney, Mike Carpenter, Bob Carpenter, Bubba Carpenter, Chris Carpenter, Chris Carpenter, Chris Carpenter, David Carpenter, David Carpenter, Drew Carpenter, Hick Carpenter, Kerry Carpenter, Lou Carpenter, Matt Carpenter, Paul Carpenter, Ryan Carpenter, Frank Carpenter, Charlie Carr, Chuck Carr, Cliff Carr, George Carr, Johnny Carr, Lou Carr, Wayne Carr, Giovanni Carrara, Carlos Carrasco, DJ Carrasco, Hector Carrasco, Alex Carrasquel, Chico Carrasquel, Amelio Carreño, Joel Carreño, Cam Carrion, Mark Carrion, Ezekiel Carrera, Clemente Carreras, Bill Carrick, Bill Carrigan, Cesar Carrillo, Mattias Carrillo, Dan Gaithers, Carroll, Brett Carroll, Clay Carroll, Cliff Carroll, Cody Carroll, Corbin Carroll, Dick Carroll, Dixie Carroll, Ed Carroll, Fred Carroll, Jeremy Carroll, John Carroll, Oni Carroll, Pat Carroll, Ralph Carroll, Scott Carroll, Tom Carroll, Kid Carsey, Al Carson, Kit Carson, Matt Carson, Robert Carson, Frank Carswell, Carter, Alfred Carter, Andy Carter, Arthur Carter, Bill Carter, Charlie Carter, Chris Carter, Cliff Carter, Evan Carter, Gary Carter, Hall of Famer, Howie Carter, Jeff Carter, Jim Carter, Joe Carter, Lance Carter, Larry Carter, Lee Carter, Marlon Carter, Nick Carter, Otis Carter, Paul Carter, Sol Carter, Spoon Carter, Steve Carter, William Carter, Ed Carter, Rico Carty, Mike Caruso, Bob Caruthers, Marcos Caray Chuck Carey, Scott Carey, Jerry Cassell, Kurt Casali, Paul Casanova, Raul Casanova, Tristan Casas, Jose Cascarella, Case, Charlie Case, George Case, Bob Casey, Dan Casey, Dennis Casey, Hugh Casey, James Casey, Joe Casey, Mickey Casey, Sean Casey, Tommy Casey, Bill Cash, Dave Cash, Kevin Cash, Norm Cash, Ron Cash, Carl Cashion, Andrew Cashner, Larry Cassian, Alex Casilla, Santiago Casilla, Carlos Casimiro, Craig Caskey, Ed Caskin, John Cason, Ben Caspiris, Harry Cassidy, Jack Castle, Bobby Casava, Ed Cassian, Joe Cassidy, John Cassidy, Pete Cassidy, Scott Cassidy, Jack Cassini, Daniel Castano, Ryan Castellini, Pedro Castanello, Alex Castellanos, Humberto Castellanos, Nick Castellanos, George Castor, Jim Castelligo, Pete Castillo, and Vinny Castillo, Alberto Castillo, Bobby Castillo, Raul Castillo, Carlos Castillo, Carmelo Castillo, Diego Castillo, both retired in 2024, apparently. Eric Castillo, Fabio Castillo, Frank Castillo, Ivan Castillo, Jose Castillo, Juan Castillo, Lendy Castillo, Luis Castillo, Manny Castillo, Marty Castillo, Max Castillo, Rosny Castillo, Tony Castillo, Wellington Castillo, Wilkinson Castillo, John Castillo, Vince Castillo, Dan Castle, John Castle, Foster Castleman, Slick Castleman, Roy Castleton, Paul Castor, Corey Casto, Angel Castro, Anthony Castro, Bernie Castro, Bill Castro, Daniel Castro, Fabio Castro, Harold Castro, Jason Castro, Juan Castro, Kevin Castro, Lou Castro, Luis Castro, Miguel Castro, Ramon Castro, Rodolfo Castro, Simon Castro, Starlin Castro, Will Castro, Frank Catalanto, Troy Cate, Danny Cater, Ellie Cates, Joe Cates, Mike Cather, Ted Cather, Hardin Cathy, Willie Cathy, Keith Cato, Howdy Caton, John Catanack, Tom Catterson, Bill Caudill, Jake Caulfield, Red Cowsey, Wayne Cowsey, Cade Cavell, James Kavanaugh, John Kavanaugh, Phil Cavaretta, Andy Cavazos, Jake Cave, Ike Cavaney, Pug Cavett, Dylan Cease, Art Cicerelli, Darren Giuchina, Gavin Cicini, Slade Sassoni, Jose Cesena, Brett Cecil, Rex Cecil, Daryl Cicilline, Jose Seda, Andujar Cedino, Cesar Cedino, Dominique Cedino, Roger Cedino, Rodney Cedino, Xavier Cedino, Blake Cedarland, Armando Salaga, Gilberto Celestino, Juan Centeno, Pete Center, Orlando Cepeda, Goldie Cephas, Matthew Safiki, Jamie Serta, Ed Cermick, Rick Cerrone, Juan Ceros, John Cerruti, Bob Seri, Francisco Severelli, Mike Severac, Hunter Severanca, Yetis Cesapides, Luis Cesa, Ron Say, Alejandro Sakin, Gustavo Shakin, Julius Shakin, Elo Chacon, Paleo Chacon, Sean Chacon, Chet Chadburn, Ray Chadwick, Andrew Chafin, Leono Chacon, Bob Chocolates, David Chalk, George Chalmers, Bill Chamberlain, Craig Chamberlain, Icebuck Chamberlain, Joe Chamberlain, Wes Chamberlain, Adrian Chamberlain, Al Chambers, Bill Chambers, Cliff Chambers, Donnie Chambers, Rome Chambers, Rube Chambers, Jim Chamberlain, Chris Chambliss, Bill Champion, Mike Champion, Bob Chance, Dean Chance, Frank Chance, Hall of Famer, Ed Chandler, Spud Chandler, Daryl Chancey, Esty Chancey, Yu Chang, Les Channel, Charlie Chant, Andres Chaparro, Chappelle, Darren Chapman, Chaplin, Ed Chaplin, Tiny Chaplin, Ardolis Chapman, Ben Chapman, Calvin Chapman, Ed Chapman, Edward Chapman, Frank Chapman, Fred Chapman, Glenn Chapman, Harry Chapman, Jack Chapman, Jay Chapman, John Chapman, Calvin Chapman, Kevin Chapman, Leonardo Chapman, Matt Chapman, Ray Chapman, Sam Chapman, Travis Chapman, Harry Chappas, Larry Chappelle, Bill Chappelle, Joe Chartanabu, JT Chargois, Ed Charles, Frank Charles, Raymond Charles, Benny Charleston, Oscar Charleston, Hall of Famer, Porter Charleston, Red Charleston, Norm Charlton, Mike Chartock, Babe Charter, Pete Charton, Chase, Hall Chase, Ken Chase, Buster Chapman, Edgar Chapman, Jim Chatterton, Tyler Chatwood, Ossie Chavarria, Angel Chavez, Anthony Chavez, Andy Chavez, Eric Chavez, Jesse Chavez, Nestor Chavez, Raul Chavez, Michael Chavez, Dave Cheadle, Charlie Cheek, Robinson Checo, Harry Cheek, Virgil Cheeves, Italio Cellini, Bruce Chen, Chin Fang Chen, Wei Chen, Larry Cheney, Tom Cheney, Sung Che Chang, Rocky Cherry, Paul Chervinko, Jack Jesbro, Bob Chestness, David Chester, Mitch Chetovich, Tony Chavez, Scott Chilipriano, Scott Chiason, Travis Chick, Matt Chico, Floyd Schiffer, Harry Child, Jason Childers, Matt Childers, Bill Childress, Rocky Childers, Andy Childs, Cupid Childs, Oscar Childs, Pete Childs, Sam Childs, Son Childs, Pierce Chiles, Rick Chiles, Dino Chioza, Lou Chioza, Bob Chipman, Walt Chiplo, Robinson Chirianos, Yoni Krinos, Lonnie Chisenhall, Jazz Chisholm Jr., Eli Chisholm, Tom Chisholm, John Chisholm, Harry Chitty, Steve Chitrin, Nelson Chitrin, Angel Chivoli, Bob Chopas, Jid Ho Cho, John Choat, Randy Choat, He Seek Choi, Jiman Choi, Michael Choice, Shin Su Chu, I actually saw him play, Bobby Choyland, Felix Coinard, Bill Cronu, Jackson Trio, Harry Chosen, Mike Chris, Neil Chrisley, Lloyd Christenbury, Bruce Christensen, John Christensen, McKay Christensen, Walter Christensen, Gary Christensen, Larry Christensen, Bob Christian, Justin Christian, Nick Christini, Glay Christensen, Jason Christensen, Mark Christmas, Tim Christmas, Steve Christmas, Joe Christopher, Lloyd Christopher, Mike Christopher, Russ Christopher, Thad Christopher, Vinny Chulk, Bubba Church, High Church, Len Church, Mark Church, Ryan Church, Chuck Churn, John Chury, Larry Ciafone, Archie Cianfroco, Mark Ciardi, Daryl Cias, Joe Cicero, Al Ciote, Eddie Sico, Ted Cieslick, Al Cihoki, Ed Cihoki, Adam Simber, Pete Simeo, Gino Simo, Frank Cimarelli, Tony Condriani, Alex Intrin, and Lou Chiola, and more. Pedro Sirocco, Frank Cipartri, Jeff Cirillo, George Cesar, Cisco, Galen Cisco, Steve Sisic, Jose Cisnero, Bill Sizzle, Ralph Citarella, Nick Ciufo, Aaron Civali, Moose Clawback, Bobby Clack, Anthony Claggett, Preston Claiborne, Davey Clare, Al Clancy, Bill Clancy, Bud Clancy, Jim Clancy, Euclid Clanton, Chris Klapinski, Aaron Clapp, John Clapp, Stubby Clapp, Danny Clare, Doug Clary, Clark, Albert Clark, Alex Clark, Allie Clark, Bob Clark, Bobby Clark, Brady Clark, Brian Clark, Cap Clark, Cleveland Clark, Cody Clark, Dad Clark, Danny Clark, Dave Clark, Del Clark, Doug Clark, Earl Clark, Ed Clark, George Clark, Ginger Clark, Glenn Clark, Harry Clark, Howie Clark, Jack Clark, Gerald Clark, Jermaine Clark, Jim Clark, Maceo Clark, Mark Clark, Matt Clark, Mel Clark, Mike Clark, Morton Clark, Odie Clark, Phil Clark, Ray Clark, Ricky Clark, Ron Clark, Roy Clark, Sensation Clark, Spider Clark, Terry Clark, Tony Clark, Watson Clark, Will Clark, Willie Clark, Wynn Clark, Zach Clark, Artie Clark, Bob Clark, Calvin Clark, Dad Clark, Darren Clark, Fred Clark, Gray Clark, Harry Clark, Clenley Clark, Horace Clark, Jay Clark, Josh Clark, Lefty Clark, Roof Clark, Stan Clark, Stu Clark, Stumpter Clark, Taylor Clark, Tommy Clark, Webbo Clark, William Clark, Bill Clarkson, Buster Clarkson, Dad Clarkson, John Clarkson, Hall of Famer, Walter Clarkson, Ellis Clary, Marty Clary, Emmanuel Classe, Jonathan Classe, Gowell Classette, Alex Claudio, Fritz Clausen, Al Klaus, Brandon Clausen, Jimmy Claxton, Clay Clay, Bill Clay, Darren Clay, Danny Clay, Clayton Clay, Slam Clay, Royce Clayton, Zach Clayton, Ralph Skleeg, Mark Clear, Joe Cleary, Garrett Cleavinger, Bob Clemens, Chet Clemens, Clem Clemens, Doug Clemens, Cody Clemens, Paul Clemens, Roger Clemens, not in the Hall of Fame, Bill Clemenson, Ernie Clement, Fred Clement, Jeff Clement, Matt Clement, Wally Clement, Edgar Clemente, Roberto Clemente, Hall of Famer, Jack Clements, Pat Clements, Chris Clemens, Lance Clemens, Vern Clemens, Don Clendenin, Michelo Cleto, Duke Cleveland, Elmer Cleveland, Reggie Cleveland, Steve Cleavinger, Tex Cleavinger, Mike Cleavinger, Brett Cleveland, Stan Silburn, Stu Silburn, Lucer Clifford, Harlan Clift, Flea Clifton, Monk Klein, Ty Klein, Gene Kleins, Billy Clingham, Jim Clinton, Lou Clinton, Tyler Clifford, Tony Cloninger, Blad Klontz, J.D. Closser, Al Closser, Ken Cloud, Ed Clow, Bill Clowers, Tyler Cloyd, Brian Clutterbuck, Danny Clyburn, David Clyde, Tom Clyde, Bill Clymer, Otis Clymer, James Coachman, Pete Coachman, Andy Oakley, Gil Doan, Jim Coates, Buck Coates, Jason Coates, Alex Cobb, George Cobb, Herb Cobb, Joe Cobb, Lorenzo Cobb, Ty Cobb, Hall of Famer, W. Cobb, Dave Kobe, Jamie Kokenar, George Cochran, Goat Cochran, Dave Cochran, Mikey Cochran, Mickey Cochran, Hall of Famer, Jimmy Cochran, Jim Cockman, Alan Cockrell, Phil Cockrell, Pasquale Coco, Gene Kogerman, Chris Cordioli, Kyle Cody, Roberto Cello, Jack Kofi, Todd Kofi, Ivan Kofi, Dick Kaufman, George Kaufman, Kevin Kaufman, Dick Cogan, Tony Cogan, Dave Cogan, Frank Cogans, Rich Cogans, Chris Coughlin, Ed Cogswell, Alta Cohen, Andy Cohen, Hi Cohen, Jim Cohen, Sid Cohen, Pancho Cohen, Phil Coke, Jimmy Coker, Chris Colabero, Mike Colangelo, Carlos Colas, Jose Colas, Oscar Colas, Rocky Colavito, Mike Colburn, Greg Colbert, Nate Colbert, Vince Colbert, Jim Colburn, Greg Colburn, Tom Copeland, AJ Cole, Alex Cole, Archie Cole, Bert Cole, Cecil Cole, Dave Cole, Dick Cole, Ed Cole, Garrett Cole, King Cole, Stu Cole, Taylor Cole, Victor Cole, Willis Cole, Arthur Coleman, Bob Coleman, Casey Coleman, Choo Choo Coleman, Kurt Coleman, Dave Coleman, Dusty Coleman, Dylan Coleman, Ed Coleman, Gilbert Coleman, Gordy Coleman, Jerry Coleman, Joe Coleman, John Coleman, Luis Coleman, Melvin Coleman, Michael Coleman, Percy Coleman, Ray Coleman, Rip Coleman, Vince Coleman, Walter Coleman, Chad Coles, Chuck Coles, Darnell Coles, Ralph Coles, Chris Coletta, Billy Colgan, Alvin Kalina, Edward Kalina, Alan Colomare, Hap Collard, Willie Colazzo, Bob Collier, Lou Collier, Orlin Collier, Harry Cauliflower, Collins, Atkins Collins, Bill Collins, Bob Collins, Chubb Collins, Dan Collins, Dave Collins, Don Collins, Eddie Collins, Hall of Famer, Eddie Collins, Gene Collins, George Collins, Hub Collins, Isaac Collins, Jimmy Collins, Hall of Famer, Joe Collins, Kevin Collins, Orth Collins, Pat Collins, Bill Collins, Ray Collins, Rip Collins, Ripper Collins, Shano Collins, Sonny Collins, Tim Collins, Tyler Collins, Wilson Collins, Zach Collins, Zip Collins, Josh Colemanter, Jackie Coleman, Bill Culver, Frank Coleman, Alex Colome, Jesus Colome, Bartolo Colon, Christian Colon, Chris Colon, Joe Colon, Roman Colon, Dick Colpart, Lloyd Colson, Alex Colthurst, Larry Colton, Bob Coluccio, Tyler Colvin, Shane Kohler, Jim Kozel, Jeff Comby, Earl Combs, Earl Combs, Hall of Famer, Jack Combs, Merrill Combs, Pat Combs, Jorge Comella, Steve Comer, Wayne Comer, Charlie Comiskey, Hall of Famer, Jim Command, Adam Komorski, Clint Campton, Jack Compton, Mike Compton, Pete Compton, Keith Comstock, Ralph Comstock, Clint Conistar, Dave Concepcion, Gerardo Concepcion, Michelle Concepcion, Onyx Concepcion, Ramon Conde, Clay Condry, Bob Cohn, David Cohn, Fred Cohn, Michael Conforto, Buck Conjalton, Dick Conger, Hank Conger, Billy Congelaro, Tony Congelaro, Griffin Connie, Jeff Connie, Alan Conkright, Jocko Conlon, Adam Conley, Bob Conley, Ed Conley, Gene Conley, Snipe Conley, Jocko Conlon, PJ Conlon, Brett Con, Fritzy Connolly, Red Connolly, Sarge Connolly, Bruce Conister, Frank Connington, Gene Connell, Joe Connell, Peter Connell, Terry Connell, Bill Connolly, Steve Connolly, Tom Connolly, Bud Connolly, Ed Connolly, Joe Connolly, Tom Connolly, Jim Connor, Joe Connor, John Connor, Ned Connor, Roger Connor, Bill Connors, Chuck Connors, Jerry Connors, Joe Connors, Merv Connors, Theodore Conover, Brooks Conrad, Ben Conroy, Tim Conroy, Wade Conroy, Billy Consolo, Jim Constable, Jose Constanza, Sandy Conseguera, Jason Contil, Carlos Contreras, Jose Contreras, Luis Contreras, Mark Contreras, Nardi Contreras, Rosani Contreras, William Contreras, Wilson Contreras, Jim Converse, Bill Conway, Charles Conway, Dick Conway, Jack Conway, Jerry Conway, Jim Conway, Owen Conway, Pete Conway, Rick Conway, Ed Conwell, Herb Conyers, Joe Conzelman, Dale Coogan, Dan Coogan, Aaron Cook, Andy Cook, Billy Cook, Cliff Cook, Cornelius Cook, Dennis Cook, Doc Cook, Earl Cook, Glenn Cook, Jim Cook, Mike Cook, Paul Cook, Ron Cook, Ryan Cook, Dusty Cook, Fred Cook, Jimmy Cook, Steve Cook, Brent Cookson, Mike Coolbaugh, Scott Coolbaugh, Duff Cooley, Bobby Coombs, Cecil Coombs, Danny Coombs, Jack Coombs, Ron Coomer, William Coon, which is unfortunate because I'm not 100% sure, but 1875 to 1876, Bill Cooney, Bob Cooney, Jimmy Cooney, Johnny Cooney, Phil Cooney, Tim Cooney, Sam Coonrod, Cooper, Alex Cooper, Andy Cooper, Hall of Famer, Anthony Cooper, Army Cooper, Bill Cooper, Brian Cooper, Cal Cooper, Cecil Cooper, Claude Cooper, Darty Cooper, David Cooper, Don Cooper, Garrett Cooper, Gary Cooper, Guy Cooper, James Cooper, Mort Cooper, Pat Cooper, Sam Cooper, Scott Cooper, Tom Cooper, Walter Cooper, Wilbur Cooper, Mace Copeland, Scott Copeland, Rocky Coppinger, Henry Capola, Trace Coquillette, Alex Cora, Joey Cora, Charles Corbett, Doug Corbett, Gene Corbett, Joe Corbett, Sherman Corbett, Archie Corbin, Patrick Corbin, Ray Corbin, Claude Corbett, Daniel Sorcino, Art Corcoran, Jack Corcoran, John Karakin, Larry Karakin, Mickey Karakin, Mike Karakin, Ray Karakin, Tim Karakin, Tommy Karakin, Ryan Cordell, Chad Cordero, Frankie Cordero, Francisco Cordero, Jimmy Cordero, Will Cordero, Eric Cordier, Alan Cordoba, Francisco Cordova, Marty Cordova, Pete Cordova, Brian Corey, Ed Corey, Fred Corey, Mark Corey, Chuck Corrigan, Roy Corrin, Phil Corrigan, John Corkill, Mike Corkins, Lance Cormier, Ray L. Cormier, Marty Cornejo, Nate Cornejo, Reed Cornelius, Willie Cornelius, Jeff Cornell, John Cornelli, Brad Conant, Terry Cornmutt, Manny Corpus, Carlos Corporan, Pat Corrales, Carlos Correa, Ed Correa, Francisco Correa, Kevin Correa, Rod Correa, Vic Coral, John Corden, Red Corden, Frank Corden, Jim Corsi, Barry Cort, Jess Corstaza, Aurelio Cortez, Don Cortez, David Cortez, Nestor Cortez, Fernando Cortez, Al Corwin, Jared Corsardi, Joe Corscart, Pete Corscarat, Ray Coisy, Mike Cosgrove, Tom Cosgrove, Jim Cosman, Shane Costa, Mike Costanza, Chris Cost, Don Costello, John Costello, Tim Costo, Humberto Coda, Henry Cote, Pete Cote, Caleb Cotham, Dan Cotter, Dick Cotter, Ed Cotter, Hooks Cotter, Tom Cotter, Chuck Cotter, Henry Cotto, Jarrell Cotton, Ensign Cottrell, Neil Koch, Johnny Couch, Mike Couchy, Bill Coughlin, Dennis Coughlin, Ed Coughlin, Roscoe Coughlin, Marlon Cautry, Danny Columb, Bob Colson, Chip Coulter, Fritz Combe, Craig, Council, Ryan, Clint, Courtney, Ernie Courtney, Harry Courtney, John Corthright, D. Cosino, Jake Cousins, Scott Cousins, John Coatlangus, Harry Kovelski, Stan Kovelski, Jack Covini, Dylan Covey, Chet Covington, Sam Covington, Tex Covington, Wes Covington, Billy Cohen, Johnny Cohen, Caleb Coward, Al Cohens, Colin Cowgirl, Joe Cowley, Cotton Cowser, Alfonso Cox, Austin Cox, Bill Cox, Billy Cox, Bobby Cox, Hall of Famer, Casey Cox, Comer Cox, Danny Cox, Darren Cox, Dick Cox, Ernie Cox, Frank Cox, George Cox, Glenn Cox, James Cox, Jeff Cox, Jim Cox, Larry Cox, Les Cox, Red Cox, Roosevelt Cox, Steve Cox, Ted Cox, Terry Cox, Tom Cox, Bill Coyle, Toots Coyne, Charlie Cozart, Harry Cozart, Zach Cozart, Dylan Cousins, not the hockey player, Roy Crabb, Felix Crabb, George Crabb, Estelle Crabtree, Tim Crabtree, Walt Craddock, William Craddock, Ricky Cradle, Harry Kraft, Molly Kraft, Howard Craig, Alan Craig, Charlie Craig, George Craig, Homer Craig, Joe Craig, Pete Craig, Rod Craig, Roger Craig, Will Craig, Jesse Crane, Jerry Cram, Bill Kramer, Bobby Kramer, Doc Kramer, Edward Kramer, Del Crandell, Doc Crandall, Ed Crane, Fred Crane, Sam Crane, Gavy Kravitz, Bill Carver, Tyler Cravey, Brandon Crawford, Carl Crawford, Carlos Crawford, Evan Crawford, Forrest Crawford, George Crawford, Glenn Crawford, Hubert Crawford, J.P. Crawford, Jake Crawford, Jim Crawford, Joe Crawford, Ken Crawford, Cutter Crawford, Larry Crawford, Pat Crawford, Paxton Crawford, Sam Crawford, Hall of Famer, Sam Crawford, not Hall of Famer, Steve Crawford, Willie Crawford, Dewey Creary, George Creamer, Joe Creedy, Bertie Creed, Connie Creedon, Pat Creedon, Mark Cregan, Doug Creek, Willie Creek Crack, Jack Creel, Keith Creel, Gus Creeley, Pete Cregan, Bernie Krieger, Bob Cremens, Frank Crespi, Alejandro Crespo, Cesar Crespo, Felice Crespo, Rogelio Crespo, Walker Crest, Jack Cresson, Dylan Cruz, Tim Cruz, Stefan Crichton, Kyle Crick, Jerry Kreider, Lou Krager, Burra Krigler, Burlane Krim, Chuck Krim, Jack Crimian, Dave Cripp, Dave Crisconi, Tony Criscola, Pat Christian, Nad Bill Chrismit, Coco Crisp, Joe Crisp, Dode Crisp, Chess Crisp, Bill Crystal, Leo Cristante, Cooper Criswell, Jeff Criswell, Morio Critchley, Huey Critz, Garrett Crochet, Claude Crocker, Davy Crockett, Frank Crockett, Kyle Crockett, Art Croft, Harry Cout, Fred Collis, Leroy Cromartie, Warren Cromartie, D.T. Cromer, Trip Cromer, Herb Crompton, Ned Crompton, C.J. Crone, Chris Crone, Kevin Crone, Roy Crone, Jake Cronenworth, Bill Cronin, Dan Cronin, Declan Cronin, Jack Cronin, Jim Cronin, Joe Cronin, Hall of Famer, Norisco Crook, Tom Crook, Jack Crooks, Tyler Cropley, Bobby Crosby, Bubba Crosby, Casey Crosby, Ed Crosby, George Crosby, Ken Crosby, Walter Crosby, Frankie Crossetti, Cross, Amos Cross, Clarence Cross, Frank Cross, Jeff Cross, Joe Cross, Live Cross, Lem Cross, Monty Cross, Norman Cross, Frank Crossland, Doug Crothers, Michael Crowder, Joe Crofty, Bill Crouch, Jack Crouch, Frank Croucher, Buck Kraus, Hans Kraus, Rich Croucher, Aaron Crow, Dean Crow, Don Crow, Pete Crow Armstrong, General Chowder, George Crow, Trevor Crow, Will Crow, Billy Crow, Cap Crow, Jim Crow, Bill Crowley, Ed Crowley, John Crowley, Terry Crowley, Woody Krausen, Eric Crozier, Francisco Croqueta, Mike Crudette, Martin Crew, Walton Cruz, Cal Crum, Alex Crumbly, Gene Crumbling, Buddy Crump, James Crump, Roy Crumper, Dick Crutcher, Jimmy Crutchfield, Press Crutcher, Delvey Cruz, Enrique Cruz, Fausto Cruz, Fernando Cruz, Hector Cruz, Henry Cruz, Ivan Cruz, Jacob Cruz, Jesus Cruz, Jose Cruz, Juan Cruz, Julio Cruz, Luis Cruz, Nelson Cruz, Omar Cruz, O'Neill Cruz, Reiner Cruz, Steve Cruz, Todd Cruz, Tommy Cruz, Tony Cruz, Victor Cruz, Jose Cucas, Mike Cabbage, Darwin Cubalon, Al Cusinello, Tony Susinello, Arthur Cucarillo, Michael Cuddier, Jim Cudworth, Bobby Cooler, Charlie Cooler, Mike Cooler, Basilo Cuera, Bert Cueto, Johnny Cueto, Manuel Cueto, Noel Cuevas, William Cuevas, John Cliff, Charlie Culberson, Leon Culberson, Jack Cullen, John Cullen, Tim Cullen, Roy Cullenbine, Dick Culler, Nick Cullup, Bernard Colton, Will Colmer, Culp, Benny Culp, Bill Culp, Ray Culp, George Culver, John Cumberland Cummings, Candy Cummings, Hall of Famer, Chance Cummings, Jack Cummings, John Cummings, Midre Cummings, Steve Cummings, Brandon Compton, Will Cunane, Brandon Cunningham, Aaron Cunningham, Bert Cunningham, Bill Cunningham, Bruce Cunningham, George Cunningham, Harry Cunningham, Joe Cunningham, John Cunningham, Marion Cunningham, Mike Cunningham, Ray Cunningham, Todd Cunningham, Vernon Cunningham, George Cuppy, Walter Curley, John Kieran, Sammy Kieran, Lafayette Kieran, Bill Curie, Clarence Curie, Murphy Curie, Perry Kieran, George Curry, Homer Curie, Jim Curry, Rube Curie, Steve Curry, Tony Curie, Wes Curie, Xavier Curie, Curtis, Chad Curtis, Cliff Curtis, Colin Curtis, Fried Curtis, Gene Curtis, Harry Curtis, Jack Curtis, Jermaine Curtis, John Curtis, Vern Curtis, Willie Curtis, Zach Curtis, Jim Curtis, John Curtis, Guy Kurthright, Ed Cushman, Harvey Cushman, Andy Kuziak, John Kuziak, Chester Cuthbert, Ned Cuthbert, George Cutshaw, Kiki Culver, Mick Culver, Mike Svengros, Al Seifert, Eric Sir, Tyler Sir, and Jim Sizolowski.
And again, thank you for tuning into the videos. Don't forget that you can also see me on Patreon at Sammy5436, where it's $1 a month. I also am seeable on Instagram at Sammy54361. TikTok at Sammy5436. I'm on Blue Sky at Sammy5436, though I don't use that often. I believe I'm on Tumblr at Sammy5436, but I haven't used that in at least a year. And you can find me at my business email, thetrapezoidtalks5436@gmail.com. Any information you need to send to those business emails will be looked at. I generally look at my business email on Wednesdays and Sundays, so just do be advised that I do not always have the ability to respond immediately, but if you do send an email to my business email, and as long as it's not offensive, I will respond if it's something I'm interested in with something positive, and if it's something I'm not interested in, I will thank you for your email and go ahead and say that there may be a future opportunity for us to collaborate if that's something you're interested in.